All right. Like he said, welcome tonight. Hopefully, I can present some stuff that you may not have known about Rockford. I'm going to try to keep it as centralized around Rockford and the history of Rockford. And I found a lot of neat news articles in the papers, and I'd like to share some of that stuff with you guys. Um, he did introduce me, which my bio got really shrunk when I sent it to Mike, so I don't know how that happened. But my name's Andrew Enyart. I am a 1998 graduate of Science Senior High School. I do work for Norfolk Southern. I've worked as a conductor. I've worked as an engineer. I've worked as a yard master. If you know what a yard master is, a yard master is the crazy person that keeps cars sorted out in the yard and keeps control of the yard and tells the crews what to do and stuff like that. I'm presently a engineer though. I've also served as a director on the Fort Wayne Railroad Historical Society. Um, and I also run their steam engine and their diesels up there. So I am a steam qualified engineer. I have 3 children. I have a beautiful wife. I got married on Saturday. So I'm a brand new newlywed here. So, and she's also a conductor for the railroad. So we're a very railroad oriented family. My kids get tired of me saying, "Hey, this railroad went here, or this railroad went here, or this did this, or this did that," but they just have to deal with it. That's the way it is. But let's start, and we'll start off with talking about the first railroad that came to Shane's Crossing. The Toledo, Delphus, and Burlington was organized in 1879. Um, it was built as a narrow gauge. The reason they built it as a narrow gauge is because it was basically cheaper to build a narrow gauge at that time. It was built as a 3-foot narrow gauge. The western terminus of the Dayton division was Shane's Crossing. So it didn't go any further than Shane's Crossing. It came out of Mercer, came up to Shane's Crossing. In 1882, the railroad was reorganized in Toledo, Cincinnati, and St. Louis. And the reason I'm bringing up these names is because I'll say them later. That's why we're going to talk about some of this stuff. The line became the Dayton, Fort Wayne, and Chicago, and later the Cincinnati, Hamilton, and Dayton. By the time it became the Cincinnati, Hamilton, and Dayton, and by the time it became the Dayton, Fort Wayne, Chicago, it had already left Shane's Crossing. It wasn't here for very long, and we'll talk about why that was. I don't know if you noticed, but on this is actually a bond, a mortgage bond from the Dayton division, which is it's laying over here after the presentation if you want to look at it. So that means it was actually a bond issued for this division of the railroad, a mortgage bond. And it also included the part that went to Dayton, the Dayton division. And then on this one here, this is a Toledo, St. Louis, and or Toledo, Cincinnati, and St. Louis. And I have one of the mortgage bonds over there from that too. Here's a map of Mercer County, and I want to point out this right here, this line right there, goes from Mercer up to Shane's Crossing. All right, it was the first railroad to reach Shane's Crossing. This is a timetable in the 1882 timetable. If you look right there, I know I was hoping this would be just a little bit bigger, but if you look right there, it lists Shane's Crossing as a stop. And over here, there's a mention of a railroad called the Salina, Van Wert, and State Line Railroad. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. And this is the newspaper stuff I was talking about. This is some really neat stuff that you guys have access to. Mercer County Library has all this digitized. So you guys can go up there, and if you ever want to look up something or you're doing a project, type it in, you get neat stuff like this. But this basically says down here that there were 4 trains at that time that came Shane's Crossing. Now, it's actually 2 trains because the trains came up here, stopped, and it went back. But they had different numbers. So the railroad would say, hey, that's 4 trains. That's the way the railroad works. So the trains arrived in in town at 8:30 a.m., departed at 8:50 a.m., and then train 23 arrived at 2:43 p.m. and departed at 3 p.m. So at that time there was 4 trains, and this is 1883 that this newspaper article came from. So at that time there was 4 trains, 4 passenger trains that came to town. Now, a lot of times with this railroad, I would assume that the freight came in with it on the passenger train. They got rid of it, switched it out, but they also had freight trains that would come up here. And freight trains aren't on the public timetable because if you're riding the train, you don't care when the freight train comes to town. So this is that branch line I was talking about. This is Mercer, and there is practically nothing that you can recognize from this line anymore. I went out the other day to specifically look for telltale signs of it. It's practically all gone. The cemetery in Mercer's still there, and that's where the line started and went up. The church sits about where it where it crosses the road right there, because the school building is still there, and that's the school building. And the route of the line, this is 33, or what became 33, and the line crossed over at Mercer and crossed over just outside of town. The only sign that I can see of that branch line is if you go down 2nd Street towards 33, right along the north side there, you can actually see the grade where the railroad went. And that's the only sign of that railroad that I could find that still exists. Other than that, it's totally disappeared. So, this is an article from 1883 that's talking about the railroad coming in from Mercer. And it says the railroad is doing heavy business. The engine holding was doing the switching. The pay car paid its workers. By the way, this is an August newspaper. The pay car paid its workers its June payment in August. So they might have been just a little behind there. And here's another map that shows the line. Although this map, like a lot of maps at the time, I'm still trying to figure out how Minden is right beside Mercer, because anybody knows Minden is just a little further. But in that map it shows, and this is actually a gas field map, which showed the railroads and no roads, but it shows the railroad. The line that we're talking about there lasted until 1883. A lot of these articles show trains still coming into Rockford until 1883, but the arrival of the railroad that I'm going to talk about next basically made the line obsolete, and it was sold in a sheriff's sale in 1883. And it was more so because the railroad at the time was reorganizing. That railroad went through a lot of bankruptcies, went through a lot of financial turmoil, and reorganized a lot of times. And there's a lot of different names. I tried to keep it simple with the names because there was name after name after name. When they would reorganize, they would do that. I don't know when exactly the line was removed, but I know as far as they were still running trains into October of 1883, and because there was 2 railroads in Shane's Crossing by that time. So, hey, I had a slide for that. What do you know? So let's talk about what might have been, because this is an interesting story to that little line that came up from Mercer. Again, 1883 article here states that it's only 9 miles to build to Wilshire, and the TC in St. Louis is going to be reorganized later on. So basically, there was talk about building the line continuing up to Wilshire, and if you know, there was a line that there at Wilshire that was also a narrow gauge railroad that was part of the Toledo, Toledo, Delphus, and Burlington, and later the Toledo, Cincinnati, and St. Louis. All this stuff gets hard to say because they've got so many letters in them. But basically, they wanted to build up there so that they didn't have to go the 40 miles back to Delphus to get the goods to the west. So when this railroad was organized, it states in this is an 1888 manual of railroads, and basically gave history, gave their balance sheets, gave who the officers were, things like that. But there's a notation in it, and the notation says, by charter of the latter extension, the line from Mercer to Fort Wayne, Indiana, a distance of 43 miles, is projected. So at one time, they were actually, the railroad that took over and reorganized was still considering building the line up to Wilshire and then on to Fort Wayne. So much so, this became an idea. This is a 1901 map of the CH&D, which was the railroad that took over after the railroad that took over after the railroad that took over. Follow me so far? But this map of the CH&D in 1901 shows this curious little thing on the map. Do you see this little part right here? That railroad never existed. But yet it was on the 1901 CH&D map because they were still considering building that section of railroad up to Wilshire. Unfortunately, it never happened. And who knows what could have happened, because if you follow the CH&D history, later on in the CH&D, of course, they ran into financial troubles, and they were eventually bought by the Ringling Brothers. This line was, the Dayton branch was, but at one time, the Pennsylvania Railroad was considering buying it to run to Delphus, so they had a shortcut to Fort Wayne from Dayton. If that line had been put in, that would have shortened the line to Fort Wayne by 40 some miles. And it could have still been here today, but we never know because it never happened. So let's talk about the second railroad that came to town. The second railroad that came to town, it's called the Salina Van Wert State Line Railroad. It was organized in April of 1878. And here's a bond, a proposal that was in the Van Wert paper. And this says, this is a letter to Van Wert and asking for funds for construction. It talks about building to the Kokomo Railroad, which was an enterprise. Now, who knows where Enterprise is at? It's Ohio City, isn't it? Ohio City was actually called Enterprise before it was called Ohio City. So they were actually talking about building to Ohio City. But in the next line, it says, where do we go from there? It says, would we go to Mercer or do we go to Shanesville? They called it Shanesville instead of Shanes Crossing. But they weren't sure once they built the line whether they were going to go to Mercer or whether they were going to come here. Some of the people that were involved with that line, though, involved with the incorporation of the line, were Rockford citizens. Calvin Alexander, lawyer, Justice of the Peace, very large influence to bring the railroad here. Cornelius Smith, banker, agriculturist, who I think, if you look at the plat maps, actually owned this property that's just right outside the door here. J.H. Pennell, again, if you look at a plat map, these were large landowners, and they were encouraging the railroad to come this direction. J.P. Dysart, CEO owned a spoke factory, 2 workhouses, grain elevator here. He also had an opera house. You guys probably know about that if you know Rockford history. R. Van Tilburg, another property owner, owned a lot of property out on the west side of town, out about where Shane's Park's at, or that area. There's actually a addition It's a Van Tilburg edition. That's his property. Um, and D.H. Robinson, he was another prominent landowner, businessman here in town. Those people were involved in the incorporation of this railroad to get this railroad built to this town. On this side of the map is another timetable. If you look, it says Van Wert, and there's several other places. It actually says Enterprise here instead of Ohio City. It says County Line. County Line became a station known as Schaefer's. It was a flag station, and it says Shane's Crossing. Well, this map is from 1880. I find this very interesting with railroads, and we'll expand upon this in a minute. In 1880, the railroad wasn't here, but it shows them coming here. So they were anticipating coming here, but they weren't here yet. The road was built as 3-foot narrow gauge, just like the other line that came into town. And the first section was completed, just as the bond said when they were asking for money, to the Delphus and Kokomo Railroad in Van Wert County, which was Enterprise. So they built from Van Wert down to Enterprise first. In 1880, the line was extended to the Mercer County line. So you remember the other timetable, it said County Line. That's where the railroad ended at that time. It didn't come to Shane's Crossing yet. In 1881, this railroad was incorporated, the Salina Van Wert Michigan Railroad. And on March the 5th, they bought the Salina Van Wert and State Line Railroad. But here's another one. This is an 1880. What is this? 1880, yes. Another 1880. There again, shows Shane Crossing, shows the county line. Didn't make it to Shane's Crossing yet, but it was on the schedule. Like I said, the railroads did this a lot. So in 1883, the railroad built 38.5 miles from the county line down to Greenville. Here's a news article from 1883, Salina Van Wert. And if you notice, June the 30th, but it says Salina Excursion, November the 10th. So here we go. The railroad isn't into Salina yet. It's made it to Shane's Crossing, but they're already selling tickets to go to Salina. It's not even built. In this article, it says the railroad's been placed to Tama. The track is some 5 miles south of this place, referring to Rockford at that time. It says, expect to attend the fair via the new road. So they had high hopes, considering this was August 25th, but they only made it to Tama. But they still were selling tickets to Salina in November. By the way, the excursion, the 35 cents it would have cost, is $11.23 in today's money. So that's what it would have cost to run between here and Salina at that time. So here's what one of the locomotives that came into Rockford would have looked like. This is a Salina Van Wert, Michigan engine. At this time, that engine was still a narrow gauge engine. So we reached October of 1883. It says in 2 weeks, you'll be able to ride to Salina. So they made their November excursion to Salina for 35 cents. But it also talks about another interesting thing in this article. Right here, it talks about the rail at the depot was iron rail. Does everybody know what the railroads are now? They're made out of steel, not iron. Holds up better, rides better. But that gives us an insight into something. The rails by the depot, because when this line came through, like you said, right outside this building, when the line came up from Mercer, ended at where the depot is. So that means most likely the rails that ran to Mercer were iron rails. the whole way. And when the other railroad came through, they replaced them with steel rails. They upgraded what was built to Mercer. So let's talk about what became of this line of Enyart, Michigan. In 1887, this line of Enyart, Michigan was consolidated into the Michigan and Ohio, and the Michigan and Ohio became the Cincinnati, Jackson, and Mackinac Railroad. Still a narrow gauge railroad at this point in time. But in 1888, the railroad was converted to standard gauge. As per this article, this is actually an article from the Salina paper, talking about all three of the railroads by that time were converted to standard gauge railroad. The reason they converted to standard gauge is because although narrow gauge is cheaper to lay down, if you want a boxcar to go from here to the West Coast or here to, Florida or here to, it had to be standard gauge because the Union Pacific Railroad at the time, the Central Pacific Railroad at the time was all standard gauge. That's the Western railroads. The Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe was standard gauge. It took money to get that freight off that narrow gauge boxcar or whatever car was on, flat car, and put it on a standard gauge car. And they discovered very quickly that having a standard gauge railroad was going to be the way of the future. So that's why they converted it to a standard gauge. The Cincinnati, Jackson, Mackinac stuck around until December the 7th, 1894, when, and I really simplified this because you'll find during this time, like I've said before, railroads were buying railroads, railroads were buying this, doing this. They consolidated. They might have had a name and never had any equipment that said that name on it, but on paper, that railroad existed. So I kind of simplified this down. The Cincinnati Northern was basically a railroad that was formed from the Cincinnati, Jackson, and Mackinac. Everybody who owned the Cincinnati, Jackson, and Mackinac, to get rid of the debt, they renamed the railroad, and everybody bought back into the stock, and voila, they didn't have any debt. Now they're the Cincinnati Northern Railroad. That's basically how it happened. So in 1902, the Cincinnati Northern came under the control of what's known as the Big Four Railroad, the Cleveland, Cincinnati, Chicago, and St. Louis. Basically, they bought the stock. And although they didn't become the Big Four Railroad, they were controlled by the Big Four Railroad because they owned the majority of the stock at that time. So let's talk about some numbers. That's enough history for now, right? You're done with history, right? What you got? Okay. Narrow gauge is, like I said, there are different gauges of narrow gauge. Okay, the narrow gauge that was built here was 3-foot narrow gauge. Okay, the track was 3 foot from center to center of the rail. Standard gauge in the United States now is, does anybody know what it is? It's a real easy number to remember. 4 foot 8.5 inches. Okay, that's standard gauge in the United States now. What's interesting is the state of Ohio at one point in time had standard gauge at 4 foot 9 inches. Now, standard gauge at 4 foot 9 inches is wonderful because you can run 4 foot 8.5 on 4 foot 9. It's sloppy, but you can do it. But you can't run 4 foot 8.5, or you can't run 4 foot 9 on 4 foot 8.5 because the axles are too wide. It spreads the rail. So sometime around the late 1890s, the Ohio kind of got with the program and said, yeah, we're going to go 4 foot 8.5 like everybody else. And that became the standard gauge of the United States. And interesting note on standard gauge. Have you ever heard the story about the chariots? Roman chariots from wheel to wheel are 4 foot 8.5 inches. And they used to create ruts in the road. And so wagons, before they had the railroads, would make their axles and their wheels 4 foot 8.5 inches across, because when the Roman chariots would go through the ruts, the wagons could follow the ruts of the chariot without tearing up their wagons. So that became standard gauge. It's just a little goofy tidbit of knowledge. um, in Rockford, though, let's get back to some Rockford stuff now that we've got a overall of how the railroads came to Rockford. In 1909, from the station agent's book, in Rockford alone, there were 19,309 tickets sold. That is a huge number for a town of about 1,000 people. Huge number. So where did these tickets go that these people bought? Let's go over some of that stuff. Some of the things that were advertised in the paper at that time were these right here. Take me out to the ball game. You could board a train in Rockford, Ohio, go to a Cincinnati Reds ball game, and then come home. And those tickets were $1.25. And since I was big on the calculator last night, that's about $43 today to go to Cincinnati and back. But you didn't have to drive. You didn't have to contend with anything. Of course, at that time, this would have been 1907 actually, that these tickets were issued. But so baseball not for you. How about the fair? Here's a picture of people waiting at the depot in Rockford to go to the Banner Fair. And not only could you go to the Mercer County Fair by special train, because they ran special trains just to go to the fair. Here's another picture of people waiting to go to the fair. But you could go to the Darke County Fair, or you could go to the Van County Fair. And these trains, were special trains that they ran just to go to the fair. I thought it was kind of interesting on the Van County Fair. It talks about it right here that it actually departed the depot, which, if any of you know where the depot was in Van Wert, it's kind of up by where the library is now, just west of where the library was. But it departed the depot 5 minutes before it picked up people at the fair. And that was probably because they took the train up and they turned the engine and brought it back between runs. But they actually made a stop at the fair grounds, which there was no depot there. But they actually stopped at the fairgrounds to pick up people. Yes, it does. Yeah, right by the fairground. Yep, that's still the Cincinnati Northern, and unfortunately, it ends just about half a mile south of there. But yeah, that's exactly right. It definitely was an occasion, that's for sure. So let's say you didn't want to go to the fair. Where else could you go? How about a day trip? So one of the things that they offered was a special trip to go fishing up in Manitou Beach. Uh, this was actually a property owned by the railroad. So the railroad kind of had a kind of like a, like, hey, let's kind of push this because we're gonna make some money off of this. But you can go up there for $1.50, or take an excursion to Salina. Here's one to Salina to watch an aerial battle in 1916. Or sometimes you had things like this. This is an Eagles train that ran to Ohio City and then back. But it did stop in Rockford. It actually talks about stopping in Rockford to pick up people so that they could ride to Ohio City. And here again, the prices at the time says $1.50. That equates to about $50 in today's currency. The 40 cents to Salina works out to about $11, and the special trip to Ohio City cost about $7 in today's currency. So let's say you want to go a little further. They offered trips to Florida. Now, the Cincinnati Northern didn't go to Florida; it went to Cincinnati. But they had where you could transfer from a train to another train, and you could buy a ticket in Rockford and transfer to another train and go all the way to Florida. Or Niagara Falls. There again, Cincinnati Northern didn't go to Niagara Falls, but you'd start the trip on the Cincinnati Northern, buy your ticket here, and end up on another railroad and at Niagara Falls. They also sold trips to Los Angeles, Jamestown, which is interesting because before the presentation I was looking, there's actually a Jamestown ticket in the binder at the front of the museum up here. So they did sell tickets to Jamestown. Interesting. Or here's one to Hocking Hills down in Logan, Ohio, which to me that seems a little expensive. Um, we were talking about that earlier, and the one to Hocking Hills is like $212 in today's currency. So you can definitely drive it a lot cheaper than that today. So let's talk about politics. Maybe you're into politics. Here's a special train for William Taft's Notification Day. Does anybody know what Notification Day is? I had to look this up. I learned something too. Notification Day is when they announce your the official candidate for the presidency, and it was held in Cincinnati, Ohio, on June 28th of 1908. So you could actually buy a ticket from Rockford to go down and see Taft actually become the nomination, which Taft did become the president later in 1909, of course. Here's one for an inauguration where you could take the train to Washington, D.C. This is 1913 inauguration, which would have been Woodrow Wilson at the time. That would have been his term in office. William Taft served, and then Woodrow Wilson. And then, although it's not an excursion, I found this very interesting, so I had to include it in the politics part. William Jennings Bryan. You ever heard that name? He was a four-time candidate for U.S. president. Never won. But he spoke in Salina on the back of his car at the Cincinnati Northern Station, and then he went to Van Wert to speak. So his train would have come through here, and that would have been a special train just for him. So let's go to the next fun stuff. Send in the big hook. Does anybody know what a big hook is? I have a picture of a big hook because I should have put it on the presentation, but it came to me later. Everybody see this? That's a big hook. A big hook is used when the railroad messes up because the big hook's used to clean things up. So I found this in the paper. It has nothing to do with the railroad, but I thought it was absolutely hilarious because this was huge on the front page of the Rockford paper. Clean up the town. Oops. I have hit a button that I should not hit. There we go. So in 1911, this is just a little outside of the scope of Rockford, but it's close because the train was en route to Rockford. This talks about a train that derailed on the Morrow switch in Salina. The Morrow switch was put in because of sugar beets. Sugar beets in the 20s, in the teens, in the 20s, were real big in Mercer County. And that was another thing I didn't learn. I didn't know sugar beets were. But the switch had just been put in the year before, and the train actually derailed on that switch and caused delay of the other trains. This is an article from 1918. It talks about one of the causes that can cause a derailment. It didn't cause a derailment, luckily. But when you have a flat wheel on a car, it causes the rail to break sometimes, especially if it's cold out. And it talks about they found 100 broken rails between Van Wert and Greenville. 100 times the rail had been broken, and it delayed all the trains. So here's another train that got delayed on May 19th of 1922. And this one does pertain to Rockford. Narrowly escaped wrecking between Rockford and Ohio City when the tender of the locomotive jumped the track. And then they brought the locomotive back into town after they re-railed it. But that happened just north of town. Now, all these are incidents that came from the paper. But in 1917, the Cincinnati Northern had a terrible year. Terrible year. And what's crazy about this terrible year is all these incidents happened just south of town. So in this one here, it says the engine and the caboose left the track Saturday night and turned over. Or Sunday night. I'll learn how to read eventually. So the caboose left the track and the section men and the wrecking crew had been working late to get the track ready for traffic. That happened in February. We go to May. Wreck on McChristie Hill. You ever heard of McChristie Hill? McChristie Hill is just south of town here, in between 707 and the next road there, which I have lost what it is, but it's in between those two roads. There's just a little hill here. It's what's that? No, to the north. Yeah, so it'd be Wilson. Yeah, but this little thing right here is what they call McChristie Hill. Now, if you notice, the grade out of Rockford is a lot bigger, but that was McChristie Hill. But at that time, it says that a freight train wrecked on McChristie Hill. 2 gondolas and coal left the track and tore up the ties for quite a distance and turned over. So the trains were actually rerouted over the CH&D Railroad, and and I'm not sure the routing of that, but they probably went up to Delphus and came across on the Pennsylvania to Van Wert would be my guess. But they had to reroute trains because that's the second one in 1917. And then June 29th, Cincinnati Northern suffered another wreck, delayed traffic for some time near Tama. Trains were detoured, probably over the CH&D again, until a track could be built around, which is called a shoe fly track. But the thing that gets me about this article is I love the newspapers at the time, the way they put it. This makes the third smash up within several months between Rockford and Tama. They were very blunt about it. They must have been tired of the Cincinnati Northern just going on the ground outside of town. So we're advancing a little further into the century, and we're going to talk about the Big Four Railroad. The Big Four Railroad made a lot of money off of freight on this line. Not so much money off of passenger trains. So in 1925, they replaced the passenger trains with self-propelled gas cars. These cars were 250 horsepower, had 250 horsepower 6-cylinder engines, and they were called tri-tracks. They were called tri-tracks because this was a nickname that the railroad guys gave them, because us railroad people, we give nicknames to lots of things. But they called it that because they left Van Wert and tried to make it back. But they often were towed back. And here's an article saying, on August the 15th, they're going to take delivery of these cars. There was 4 of them. They were numbered 100 to 103. They weren't very successful. Originally, they had the motor car, and then they had a passenger car behind it. But like I said, a lot of times they wouldn't make it because the passenger car was just too much for that 250 horsepower engine. So they actually cut the passenger car off and just had the self-propelled car was what ran the passenger trains. So in 1930, the Cincinnati Northern officially was leased to the Big Four Railroad. Now, the Big Four Railroad had had control of the Cincinnati Northern since 1902, but they weren't officially part of the Big Four system. But in 1930, it was officially leased to the Big Four system. But the Big Four system was actually belonged to the New York Central system. So on that same day, the operation was transferred to the New York Central. It operated as the Big Four Cincinnati Northern, part of the New York Central. That's very confusing, but that's how it worked. And here it talks about it. The Cincinnati Northern, after the 1st of February, will be known as the Northern Division of the Big Four Railroad. And the change will be made, whereas the Cincinnati Northern was taken over by the Big Four for 99 years. They leased the railroad for 99 years. Now, one of the things that you'll notice, if you look at these, I've got passes laid out here, but I put a couple up here. You'll see this is like a 1905 pass. See how Cincinnati Northern's real big. And then we get into the Big Four when they controlled it. See how Cincinnati Northern got a little bit smaller. Then you get to 1930. Cincinnati Northern is right there. And on some of these passes, Cincinnati Northern is actually on the back of the pass. So over time, the Cincinnati Northern name became less and less of a visual and more of a, it's on paper. This is the Cincinnati Northern. So in 1937, the Cincinnati Northern was officially merged into the Big Four system. And at that time, the New York Central system and the Cincinnati Northern officially lost its identity. It didn't exist anymore, even on paper it did, but you couldn't, like, they referred to it as the Northern Division of the Big Four at that point in time. So in 1936, the railroad filed to abandon the passenger service from Van Wert north to the Michigan state line. So a lot of people saw the writing on the wall. In October of 37, they said, we're going to do away with the passenger service on this end of the line, on the south end of the line. In response to that, even though it says Salina was represented, Rockford was represented too. In this article, it talks about the 15 different towns sent representatives to Columbus to plead with the commission not to drop the passenger trains because they felt like they needed those passenger trains to still operate. Unfortunately, the commission approved dropping the passenger trains in January of 1938. January 20th, they said, you can appeal the decision, but our decision is made that it's not beneficial for the railroad to run passenger trains anymore. So on February 1st, 1938, the Cincinnati Northern discontinued all its passenger trains through Rockford, Salina, on south. So in the 1950s, there was very little articles in the 1950s. The railroad got kind of quiet as far as specific stuff to Rockford or the local area. But they ran a lot of these ads, hyping themselves up because they wanted to be still part of the community, but you lost your passenger trains, things like that. So you didn't have those advertisements anymore. You just had advertisements saying, oh, we've put this much money into the railroad. We've done this. We've done this. One of the curious things, though, is the railroad right here decided their express business, which was still handled by train after 1938, they would bring down and you stop at the depot, and if you had a package or something like that, it could still go on a train. It would just be a freight train instead of a passenger train. But in 1951, they decided that we're going to stop doing that too, and we're going to run trucks for our express service. So the trucks ran out of Bryan and picked up the freight here in Rockford. And in 1952, Here it talks about them improving the railroad. They actually did make improvements on the railroad. In 1952, they laid 115-pound rail on this section of track, which is pretty heavy rail for 1950s. Today on our main lines, we run what they call 136-pound rail or 142-pound rail, which is massively heavy rail. But 115-pound rail is not. It's still used today in some locations on sidings and stuff like that. But that's what they actually laid on the main line down here. 115 pounds per yard is basically what it works out to. Yeah. So, and like I said, we use 142-pound rail now. That's pretty standard. They do have heavier rail in certain places, but I mean, you're talking about a massive amount of traffic that goes over it for heavier rail than that. But it does show that the railroad was still putting effort into maintaining the line down here. Unfortunately, or fortunately, I forgot I switched these slides. There was another passenger train that ran one time. The last passenger train that ever ran on this line ran on October 3rd, 1966. It was ran as an excursion, ran from Germantown, Ohio to Van Wert, Ohio, and returned. Had 519 passengers and included the mayors of Carlisle, Germantown, and Lewisburg. This is the last official passenger train that ever came through Rockford. Was October 3rd, 1966, and it ran both directions. That brings us to the 60s. In 1968, the New York Central merged with bankrupt Pennsylvania Railroad and became the Penn Central Railroad. This was by many standards today, this was a very bad merger. The Pennsylvania and the New York Central went virtually everywhere that the other went. So instead of being a beneficial merger, what it ended up doing is eliminating a lot of track. By June the 1st, 1970, the Penn Central declared bankruptcy. It was the largest private bankruptcy in the United States up to that time. The last train to run to Rockford on the Penn Central ran on March the 30th, 1976, and was pulled by this engine, 7193. It traveled from Van Wert to Rockford and returned to Van Wert. The next day, you might have heard of this railroad, Conrail was formed. There was a lot of rumors that happened after Penn Central shut down. And these all became rumors. It's all they were. They were basically saying, Norfolk Western's going to buy this line. They're going to do this. They're going to do that. None of this in the paper ever came to fruition. Norfolk Western did operate the line in Salina for a little bit to serve Merceman's, but they never came north of Salina. And a small railroad called the Western Ohio operated the line south of Salina, and they actually operated the part to Merceman's for a little bit also. The railroad that did take over and operate to Rockford for a while is this railroad, the Spencerville and Elgin. And it would operate from 1978 to October of 1981. Served Mercer Landmark and was one of the largest customers on the railroad. 1982, the line was removed from Ohio City to Rockford. At one time, the county was actually had a rail study proposal to buy this line down to Rockford. Unfortunately, the trustees of the Cincinnati Northern Railroad, the paper part of it, wanted far too much money for the 6 miles from Ohio City to Rockford to make it a profitable venture at that point in time. So unfortunately, we lost the line because of that. So that's about the history of the rail line. But let's talk about Rockford a little bit. So Rockford, located at milepost 116.1, this is early 1900s. This is Cincinnati Northern stuff I'm going over here. Contained a freight and passenger station. The telegraph call sign for Rockford was SA. Had 3 sidings, 2 sidings and a spur. Contained a handcar house and a privy. That's very important. Always very important. Water came from the St. Mary's River via steam pump, and there was a 56,000-gallon tank. There was an 11-ton livestock scale, 5-car capacity for livestock loading, and there was 2 bridges that the Cincinnati Northern had. One that was 103 foot, one was 338 foot, and they were wood trestles. Now, nobody ever remembers those wood trestles, because none of you are old enough to remember those wood trestles, I promise you. You probably remember that bridge that used to stand there. That bridge was put in 1906, as the article is saying, that the abridgments or the abutments were in place for one of them, and construction of the second one was underway. So that's the bridge we all remember, and it's been removed since a few years back. They took the decks off the bridges, and now only thing there is the abutments. So this is what Rockford looked like in the early 1900s. The track layout, and here's a picture. If you're on Shane's Crossings Facebook page, this picture was on Shane's Crossings page. It's a very wonderful picture because I can go like this. This caboose right here is sitting right here, and the train is down this way, and there's cars here on this track. So you can see that this is actually the track layout of Rockford. This little line that came up here is what was left of the Mercer branch. That they served an elevator down in that area for a short period of time before it was removed. And then one of the neat things about this museum, if you haven't had a chance to look around, there are several of these around. These are agent stubs. This is the other part of the ticket. When they sell a ticket, the agent would keep this part as a record. And I actually got these from this back here a few months ago. So I wanted to include those in there because I got to plug this place. This place, between this cabinet back here and that cabinet up front that has the ticket stubs in it, that stuff is almost impossible to find. And there is a wealth of information in those. And it's a blessing that you guys have this here at this organization. So, show you the depot. I meant to point it out earlier too. I don't know if you can see the station sign here where it says Rockford. I'm going to get up real close here because I want to point at this. This is important. You can tell what era the picture was taken by the sign on the depot. And the reason I say this is because, and you can see the depot sign back there, but if you notice, there's paint missing here on both ends. When the New York Central took over the railroad, they came along, and on either end of the sign, when it was Cincinnati Northern and when it was the Big Four, it used to say Jackson on one end and Cincinnati on the other end, and how many miles it was to either of those locations. When the New York Central took over, they came through and cut the sign so it just said Rockford. So you can tell after the New York Central took over that this is a picture after the New York Central took over because the sign has been cut. And here's a picture from, excuse me. And this is a picture that shows the sign has actually been painted over. It's still in place, but it's been painted over. And if you look closely, I know you can't see it on the screen, but you can actually read Rockford underneath of it. Whoever painted over it, the paint is fading through. And here's what I was talking about the sign. This is the original Rockford sign, and it's the same sign that was on the depot before. But if you notice, it's longer because it has, down here it would have said Jackson 116, and down on this end it would have said Cincinnati 124.8, I think. This is another picture around the 1909, and this picture's in the museum somewhere too. And there's just a passenger schedule that shows that the name changed to Rockford, and so did Ohio City. Ohio City became Ohio City. Here's a picture of 1972. This was still when Penn Central was running the railroad. Signs still in place. Everything's in place at the depot. This is a later picture. This is probably how most of you remember the depot, if you're young like me, because I remember it being like this. This picture was actually taken in 1980, very close to the end of the railroad's existence. But note the sign's not there anymore. Somebody's got it, probably on the wall back there. So what's left of the railroad now? I bet you a lot of people have driven past this and didn't even know this was here. Has anybody seen that before? On 118, north of town, this is County Line Road and is right here. This is the milepost 114, which should be a half a mile down this way on the railroad. But somebody took it off the right of way and put it in their yard. It's right up on 118. But it's there, and it's preserved. This is on Miller Road in Salina, Ohio. I know it doesn't pertain to Rockford, but it shows you that there is some stuff of this railroad that you can find along the route. Here's another one on the bike path, 128 miles from Jackson. Here's another one in Coldwater. Unfortunately, that's about it that remains of the railroad. When they tore it up and it was no longer viable anymore, a lot of this stuff just disappeared. I want to show you some of the, because I was talking about the locomotives of the railroads. I want to show you how they kind of changed over the years. These are CJ&M locomotives. These were narrow gauge locomotives at the time that these pictures were taken. This would have been a standard locomotive that would have come into Rockford. Cincinnati Northern locomotives got a little bit bigger. These are standard gauge locomotives. Some of them were probably narrow gauge locomotives that they converted to standard gauge locomotives. The railroad was always big on saving money, so they do that sort of stuff. When the Big Four took over, New York Central, they used locomotives that were like this. These are Mikado type locomotives. They have a 2/8 wheel arrangement. Means there's 2 wheels in the front, 4 wheels in the middle, 2 wheels in the back. This was about the biggest locomotive that they ever ran on this line. They tried what they call a Mohawk locomotive, but it was just too heavy and it didn't work very well down here. When it went to diesel, they used the smaller locomotives like I showed on the Penn Central picture. And then I thought I'd show you some equipment. This is what their boxcars looked like at the time in the 40s, things like that. And here's what the cabooses would have looked like. Originally, the Cincinnati Northern had cabooses like this. They called these bobber cabooses. Bobber cabooses only have 2 axles underneath of them. At some point in time, the state of Ohio said, we're not going to have these anymore. They didn't ride very good. They were dangerous. So they said, you've got to have 4 axles underneath like this. Now, I don't know if you notice this, but I'm going to come up here and do something. If you go like, well, let's see if I can do it like this. If you go like this, doesn't that caboose look a lot like that caboose over there on the right? Because once again, the railroad's all about saving money. So all the railroad did is just extend them, put a new frame underneath of them. They're the same caboose. Maybe not the same caboose, but they're very similar caboose. And that's what they did to do that. With that, I'm going to say, anybody got any questions? And hopefully I gave you some knowledge that you didn't have before. I've got some artifacts up here that you're more than welcome to look at. I will talk all day about railroads. Everybody knows that back in that row. So, but if you got any questions, I'd be happy to answer them if I know the answers.